fall of the Aztec Empire in the 1500s. The water tastes like death, not metaphorically, not poetically. In the summer of 1521, the canals surrounding Tenochtitlan, once crystal clear, filtered through ingenious aqueduct systems that would have impressed Roman engineers, now carry the bloated bodies of the fallen. A Mexica warrior kneels at the edge of a causeway, cupping his hands into the lake, and drinks anyway, because thirst is a more immediate enemy than pride. His throat burns, not from the brackish water, but from something else. Something that started 3 days ago as a fever. By tomorrow, his skin will erupt in pustules. By next week, he'll be another body in the canal. This is how empires end, not with a single sword thrust, but with a slow suffocation. With the realization that the gods have turned their faces away, or perhaps, more terrifying still, that they were never there at all. The city that floated on dreams. To understand what was lost, you must first see what existed. Tenochtitlan, in 1519, was not a primitive settlement awaiting European enlightenment. It was a metropolis of 250,000 souls. Larger than Paris, cleaner than London, more organized than Seville. The Spaniards who first glimpsed it from the mountain pass stood in slack-jawed silence, watching the morning mist peel away to reveal what seemed like a hallucination. A city that appeared to float on water connected by geometric causeways, its pyramids catching the first light like polished mirrors. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, a conquistador whose hands had known nothing but violence and mud, would later write that it seemed like an enchanted vision from the tale of Amadis. He was trying to describe the impossible. Streets swept clean daily, while European cities festered in their own waste. Public latrines that emptied into managed fertilizer systems, while Parisians dumped chamber pots from windows. Botanical gardens displaying thousands of species, organized with scientific precision that wouldn't reach Europe for another century. The Chinampas, those floating gardens, were not quaint curiosities. They were agricultural technology that could feed a massive urban population from what was essentially swampland. Willow trees planted at precise intervals, their roots binding the rectangular plots. Mud dredged from the lake bottom, rich with nutrients, layered like a dark cake. Channels between them allowing canoes to navigate, creating a city that moved as much by water as by foot. Walk through the Tlatelolco market on any given day, 60,000 people engaged in commerce, the air thick with the scent of cacao, vanilla, smoked chilies, fresh amaranth, the sound of obsidian being knapped into blades, sharper than any steel the Spanish possessed. Jade workers creating art that required tools the Europeans couldn't fathom. Gold and silver being worked not for mere accumulation, but for beauty, a concept that would prove fatal when it met Spanish hunger. The aqueduct from Chapultepec brought fresh water across miles of lake, 2 parallel channels, so maintenance could be performed on one while the other flowed. Water fountains at precise intervals throughout the city, public and private baths, a population that bathed daily, a practice that horrified the Spanish, on who believed water opened the pores to disease. This was the world's most advanced hydraulic civilization, a place where astronomy reached heights that allowed calendar systems of stunning precision, where universal education existed for both boys and girls, not literacy in the European sense, but training in history, religion, warfare, and crafts, where doctors performed successful skull surgeries, setting broken bones with casts, using willow bark for pain relief in a way that prefigured aspirin, and at its center stood Moctezuma Xocoyotzin, the younger, 9th ruler of the Mexica people, sovereign of the Triple Alliance, a man who washed himself 4 times daily and never wore the same clothes twice. A leader of an empire that stretched from the Pacific to the Gulf, from the northern deserts to the southern jungles. But empires, no matter how great, are built on blood, and blood calls to blood. The Omens Moctezuma couldn't sleep. For 10 years before the Spanish arrived, the night sky had been trying to tell him something. In 1509, a comet appeared, not a brief streak, but a persistent wound in the heavens, visible even at noon, described as like a spike of fire. like a flame of fire. The priests interpreted it, reinterpreted it, sacrificed to it. It remained. Then the temple of Huitzilopochtli, the war god who had led the Mexica to greatness, caught fire. No one knew how. No lightning, no accident. Stone doesn't burn, yet it burned. Water only made it worse. The flames roaring higher, as if fed by divine rage. A fisherman brought him a strange bird, a crane with a mirror in its head. Moctezuma looked into it and saw warriors riding on the backs of deer. This is what the historical records claim. Whether literal truth or metaphorical anxiety translated through the lens of catastrophe, it speaks to a psychological state, a ruler haunted by the feeling that his world was ending before the threat had even appeared on the horizon. The priests were divided. Some saw cycles, the completion of a 52-year calendar round, always a dangerous time. Others saw something worse, the potential return of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, the morning star, the god who had departed to the east on a raft of serpents, promising to return in a year, one reed. 1519 was a year, one reed, when the reports came of floating temples on the water, ships, bearing men with pale skin and faces covered in hair, carrying deer that they rode, weapons that roared like thunder and killed from impossible distances. Moctezuma faced an impossible theological dilemma. Were these gods, emissaries of gods, or simply men who had mastered magics unknown to his people? He sent gifts, gold, turquoise, featherwork of impossible intricacy, the ritual garb of gods, a diplomatic overture that said, if you are divine, here is your tribute. If you are mortal, here is a bribe to leave us in peace. Hernán Cortés, a minor Spanish nobleman fleeing debt and mediocrity, saw the gold and made his decision. He would have it all. The meeting of worlds, November 8th, 1519. The Iztapalapa Causeway. The Spanish numbered about 400, both plus several thousand Tlaxcalan warriors, enemies of the Mexica, who had allied with these strange newcomers in the ancient calculation that the enemy of my enemy is my weapon. They had marched for months through landscapes that alternated between wonder and nightmare, through towns that sometimes welcomed them and sometimes attacked, always trying to pass whether these newcomers were opportunity or apocalypse. Now they walked across a stone causeway 8 meters wide, stretching 5 miles across Lake Texcoco, with water on both sides deep enough to swallow armies. It was a feat of engineering that impressed even the Spanish, who were not easily impressed. It was also a trap from which there was no escape if the Mexica chose to spring it. But Moctezuma had decided to meet them. He arrived on a litter carried by nobles, and his feet never touching the ground, for the sacred feet of the emperor could not touch common earth. He wore a cloak of quetzal feathers, each one more valuable than gold, arranged in patterns that took master craftsmen months to complete. Turquoise mosaic, gold ornaments, the regalia of a god-king. Cortés dismounted, or rather, climbed down from his horse, since the Mexica initially couldn't distinguish rider from beast, and attempted to embrace the emperor, a gesture of European equality that caused physical recoil from the Mexican nobles. You do not touch the emperor. You do not look directly at the emperor. You certainly do not try to hug him like a tavern friend. The translator chain was absurd. Cortés spoke Spanish to Jerónimo de Aguilar, a shipwrecked priest who had learned Mayan. As Aguilar spoke Mayan to Malintzin, La Malinche, a Nahua woman given to Cortés as a slave who spoke both Mayan and Nahuatl. She translated to Moctezuma, a game of linguistic telephone upon which the fate of empires balanced. What was actually said in that first meeting is lost to history, filtered through bias and translation, and the later justifications of victors. But we know this. Moctezuma housed the Spanish in his father's palace, fed them, entertained them, and waited to understand what they truly were. The Spanish, for their part, were terrified. They were a tiny force in the heart of a massive city, surrounded by thousands of warriors who could kill them in moments if the order was given. They slept in armor. They kept their horses saddled. They prayed to a god they weren't entirely sure was listening. And then they found the treasure room. The mask slips. Pedro de Alvarado was not a subtle man. When Cortés left Tenochtitlan to deal with a Spanish force sent to arrest him, yes, the conquistadors were themselves fugitives from Spanish law, he left Alvarado in charge, a decision that would prove catastrophic. During the festival of Toxcatl in May 1520, while Mexican nobles performed ceremonial dances in the temple courtyard, unarmed and in full regalia, Alvarado ordered the exits sealed. Then he ordered his men to attack. The reasons are disputed. Some say he feared a surprise attack. Some say he wanted to steal the gold ornaments the dancers wore. Some say he simply panicked, surrounded by a culture he didn't understand, in a city that terrified him. The result is not disputed. The Spanish and their Tlaxcalan allies massacred hundreds of unarmed nobles. The chroniclers describe blood running in the courtyard, intestines spilling on sacred ground, the flower of Mexican nobility cut down while engaged in worship. The city erupted. When Cortés returned, he found himself besieged in the palace. The Mexica had destroyed the bridges on the causeways, cut the fresh water supply, and begun a systematic siege of the Spanish position. Cortés made a desperate gamble. He brought Moctezuma to the roof to address his people, to call for peace. What happened next is where Spanish and Mexica accounts diverge completely. The Spanish claim the Mexica threw stones and arrows, and one struck Moctezuma in the head, a wound from which he later died. The Mexica accounts claim the Spanish murdered him when he was no longer useful, and the stone story was a convenient lie. Either way, the emperor was dead, and with him died any illusion of divine favor or cosmic order. La Noche Triste, the night of June 30, 1520, would be remembered by the Spanish as La Noche Triste, the sad night. The Spanish attempted to escape under cover of darkness, building a portable bridge to cross the gaps in the destroyed causeways. They loaded themselves with as much gold as they could carry, treasure from Moctezuma's vaults, melted down and divided. Some soldiers took so much they could barely walk. The Mexica were waiting, the canals filled with canoes, warriors in the water, on the causeways, on the rooftops, the night filled with war cries and the haunting sound of the death whistle, a clay instrument that produces a sound like a human scream. Designed to terrify enemies, it worked. The Spanish portable bridge broke under the weight of men, horses, and gold. Soldiers in full armor tumbled into the lake and sank like stones. The gold that they had killed for became their anchor to death. Horses screamed and drowned. The water turned red. Cortés, according to legend, sat under a tree and wept. He had lost perhaps half his force, most of his horses, nearly all the treasure. He was a broken man leading broken survivors through hostile territory, but he was alive. And unlike the Mexica, he had something more dangerous than gold. He had smallpox, the invisible genocide. The Spanish didn't defeat the Aztec Empire. Variola Major did. Imagine you are a Mexica warrior. You have survived the fighting. You have pushed the invaders from your city. You should be celebrating. But instead, you are watching your brother's face transform into a landscape of horror. Pustules covering every inch of skin, inside the mouth, down the throat. Fever that makes him speak in tongues. The smell of rotting flesh while he's still alive. Then your sister, your mother, your children. The illness came with the Spanish, specifically with an enslaved African man in the force of Pánfilo de Narváez. One man, one infected individual introduced into a population with zero immunity to a disease that had plagued Europe and Africa for millennia. The mortality rate in an immunologically naive population can reach 30 to 50%. In some Mexica communities, it approached 80%. But the numbers, while staggering, don't capture the psychological destruction. European societies had lived with smallpox for generations. Survivors bore scars. But the disease was understood, part of the natural order. Priests didn't question God's existence because of smallpox. It was simply one of many tribulations. For the Mexica, this was theological annihilation. Their gods protected them, That was the fundamental understanding. Sacrifices maintained cosmic order. Rituals kept the sun rising. Prayer and blood brought divine favor. Then why were the gods allowing this? Why were Mexica dying in droves, while the Spanish seemed immune? The Spanish could walk among the sick, and most would not fall ill. To a population trying to understand causation, this looked like divine favor. Like the Christian god was more powerful than Huitzilopochtli, Tlaloc, Quetzalcoatl, more powerful than the entire pantheon. Cuauhtémoc, the young warrior who took command after Moctezuma's death, was tried to rally resistance. But how do you resist when your population is dying faster than the enemy can kill them? When your warriors are too weak from disease to lift a makuawitl? When the priests themselves are dying, unable to perform the rituals that maintain reality? The siege Cortés rebuilt his forces. The Spanish hadn't given up. They'd regrouped. Allied with tens of thousands of indigenous warriors from Tlaxcala, Texcoco, and other cities tired of Mexican domination, built 13 brigantines, small warships, that could be carried in pieces and assembled on Lake Texcoco. This was the technological difference, the ability to project power across water in ways that canoes could not counter. In May 1521, the siege began. Tenochtitlan, built on water, surrounded by water, supplied by water, who found itself cut off from water, the aqueducts destroyed, the causeways controlled by enemies, the brigantines patrolling the lake, preventing food from reaching the city by canoe. The defenders were already weakened by smallpox. Now add starvation, then thirst. Surrounded by lake water too brackish to drink without the filtering aqueducts. They ate anything: rats, lizards, tree bark, leather. They boiled lake reeds. The Spanish chroniclers report finding defenders so weak they could barely stand, let alone fight. But they fought anyway. For 75 days, house by house, canal by canal. The Spanish and their allies would capture a section, destroy it completely so it couldn't be retaken, then move to the next. Systematic annihilation of one of the world's great cities. The Mexica defenders knew they were losing. But surrender was not in their vocabulary, not because of stubbornness, but because they understood what surrender meant. They had built their empire on conquest. They knew what victors do to the vanquished. On August 13th, 1521, Cuauhtémoc was captured while attempting to flee by canoe. The last emperor of the Mexica, 25 years old, dressed as a common warrior, tried to convince Cortés to kill him. He had fought to the last moment of viability and now wanted the honor of death. Cortés had other plans. He tortured Cuauhtémoc to reveal where the gold was hidden. The treasure supposedly thrown into the lake during La Noche Triste, burned his feet until the flesh came off, found no gold because there was no gold, eventually had him hanged as a traitor years later during an expedition to Honduras, as eliminating even the symbolic threat of Mexica royalty. The silence. After the Spanish described the aftermath as a silence, after months of war cries, death whistles, drums, and battle noise, Tenochtitlan fell silent. The survivors, perhaps 30,000 from a population of 250,000, were too weak to make sound. They emerged from rubble, skeletal, covered in sores, barely human in appearance. The Spanish forced them to tear down their own temples. The stones of Templo Mayor, the great pyramid where the Mexica had communed with their gods, became the foundation for a Catholic cathedral. Literally, the same stones. A perfect metaphor for conquest, the new world built directly on the bones of the old. The city itself was razed, the canals filled, the Chinampas destroyed, the aqueducts left to crumble. The most advanced hydraulic civilization in the Americas was deliberately erased, replaced with a Spanish colonial grid that ignored the lake, ignored the water management systems, ignored everything the Mexica had learned about living in this specific environment. Within a generation, Lake Texcoco began to flood the new Spanish city repeatedly, a problem the Mexica had solved centuries earlier. The Spanish solution was to drain the lake entirely, a project that took 3 centuries and turned a lush wetland into a dusty valley, creating the environmental disaster that is modern Mexico City's water crisis. The survivors faced a choice that wasn't a choice: convert or die, learn Spanish or remain voiceless. Forget the old ways or practice them in secret. The Spanish didn't just want territory, they wanted souls. The cultural annihilation wrapped in the language of salvation. But you cannot kill memory completely. The Nahuatl language survived, spoken by over 1 million people today. The genetic legacy of the Mexica runs through the majority of modern Mexicans. The foods, corn, beans, squash, chocolate, tomatoes, avocados, conquered the world more thoroughly than any European crop. The agricultural techniques, the botanical knowledge, the mathematical and astronomical understanding, pieces survived in fragments, in codices hidden from priests, in oral traditions maintained by grandmothers who refused to forget. And beneath the streets of Mexico City, literally beneath the pavement and subway lines and modern buildings, the temples remain. Archaeologists keep finding them, disrupting construction projects, forcing the modern city to confront the fact that it is built on top of something it tried to erase, but couldn't. What we lost, it's easy to reduce this to conquest narrative. Spanish won, Mexico lost. Technology versus obsidian, guns, germs, and steel. But that misses the staggering magnitude of what was destroyed. Entire libraries of knowledge burned by Spanish priests, who saw demonic symbols instead of sophisticated writing systems. Medical techniques that use plants European science wouldn't discover for centuries. Astronomical knowledge that rivaled anything in Renaissance Europe. Engineering solutions to problems the Spanish couldn't even recognize as problems. We lost perspectives, ways of organizing society, different answers to the fundamental questions of how humans should live together. The Mexica were not peaceful. They built their empire on blood sacrifice and military conquest. But they were also sophisticated urban planners, brilliant engineers, and people who valued education, cleanliness, and beauty in ways that contradicted every European assumption about savages. We lost the chance to see what that civilization might have become, not frozen in 1521, not romanticized as noble victims, but as a living, evolving culture that would have continued to change, adapt, and create. Every civilization that has ever existed has been imperfect. The question is not whether the Mexica were morally superior to Europeans, but whether humanity is richer or poorer for having lost their unique contributions. The answer seems obvious. Today, if you visit the Zocalo in Mexico City, the massive central plaza, you're standing on top of the ceremonial center of Tenochtitlan. The cathedral to your north sits on the ruins of the Templo Mayor. The presidential palace to your east is built on the site of Moctezuma's palace. The entire historical center is a palimpsest, the new world literally layered over the old. Sometimes, after heavy rains, the ground becomes unstable. The colonial buildings sink, crack, tilt at impossible angles. The lake beneath, never truly drained, reasserts itself. The city that was built on water keeps trying to return to water, despite centuries of concrete and denial. And in those moments, you can almost hear it, the echo of a world that ended not with glory, but with pustules and starvation, but with the slow realization that the gods were silent because they were never there, or because they had chosen differently, or because the universe is fundamentally indifferent to human suffering. The Aztec Empire fell, but the people survived, changed, traumatized, genetically and culturally transformed by catastrophe, but alive. Their descendants walk the same ground today, speaking Spanish but carrying Nahuatl words in their vocabulary, eating the same corn their ancestors engineered, looking at the same mountains. History is not a story of the past. It's a foundation of the present. The colonialism that destroyed Tenochtitlan set patterns that echo through modern Mexico. Wealth inequality, racial hierarchies, the extraction of resources by external powers. Understanding 1521 is essential to understanding 2026. I'm Fen. You're watching the past so we can understand the present, and together we keep history reborn. I'll see you in the next era.